In the 143rd Psalm, David talks to us and expresses some sentiments I think at times all of us can relate to. Because David is going through any number of different emotions. And in that 143rd Psalm, if you drop in at verse 4, he writes, "Therefore my spirit is overwhelmed within me. My heart is appalled within me." Drop down to verse 7. "Answer me quickly, O Lord. My spirit fails. Do not hide thy face from me, lest I become like those who go down into the pit. Let me hear thy loving kindness in the morning, for I trust in thee. Teach me the way in which I should walk. For to thee I deliver up my soul." David, at that moment, is experiencing depression. Depression that is unparalleled. He's at the bottom of everything. Everywhere he looks is black and bleak. He sees no way out. He sees no hope for him whatsoever. How many times have we been there? How many times have we gotten to that point where life just kind of seems to be cataclysmic as it begins to engulf us? Depression is a very real thing. Throughout the scriptures, there are any number of individuals who talk about depression, who write about it, who we're given examples thereof. But there's something really beautiful in the scriptures, and it's a promise of one that is tremendous. If you go into the 9th chapter of the book of Isaiah, and if you look at verse 6 and then down through about verse 8, there is the promise of one who is referred to as the Wonderful Counselor. I want you to stop there for a minute. And I want you just to feed on that thought. Wonderful Counselor. The promise of hope. The promise of healing. The promise of coming up out of that abysmal pit and coming back into a balance. Remember how a few weeks ago we talked about balance. And balance is the hardest thing to find in life. And then as we've been going through the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon's been talking a lot about balance and finding that equitable balance therein. And so we long for that. We look for it. To find that, I guess you could say, in an emotional sense, homeostasis, which is man at peace with himself. The scriptures promise that. The scriptures pointed out that we can find that balance. But it demands that we utilize the Wonderful Counselor. When you begin to really look at the scriptures, you can find that throughout time, man has needed a counselor. David needed one. Centuries following David, the nation of Israel split in two. Wasn't even necessarily centuries. David gave his kingdom over to Solomon. Solomon passed it down to his son, Rehoboam. And it was during the days of Rehoboam that the divided kingdom came into being. But as time went on, they moved further and further away from God. The consequences that they were forced to make, or to face, if you would, was because of things that they had done. And it ultimately, both Israel and Judah, it ultimately would cause them to be in need of a counselor. Israel, the northern kingdom, was carried away by Assyria. They never came back as a people. They had been mongrelized during their time of captivity. Judah was carried away by the Babylonians. And ultimately, they would come back 70 years later. But it was during that time of the captivity of Babylon that Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, wrote the Lamentations. And basically, what the lamentation is a dirge of how. How did we ever come to this point? How did we ever get this low? Why did we allow ourselves to go so far afield from God? And that's exactly what takes place. It is a poetic lament of how. And it's kind of in an acrostic form. Now, this afternoon, we're going to be looking in an acrostic form of how to bounce back from being in a state of depression or whatever state one might be in. And we'll look at it. But lamentation is kind of sort of that. But not so much how to bounce back, but rather how did we get ourselves into this mess? And really, when you begin to think about it and you begin to consider it, it's kind of important to know how and the consequences as a result thereof. But it's not only David, not only in the Lamentations do you find individuals who are facing depression and a state thereof. You go into 1 Samuel and look at chapters 16 through 20, and you can see where Saul, he was so sorely depressed, and the oppression then that was visited on the nation. David, we've already talked about, and we'll look at it again here in a moment. Or King Ahab in 1 Kings 21, verse 7, his depression. We spent several months looking at the book of Job, and there was a man who was really laid low. And you go, but he had a reason. Well, whether he had reason or not, he was depressed. He cried out for understanding, wanted to know why. What have I done wrong? Why do these consequences face me? And then if you turn in the New Testament into 2 Corinthians, and you go into the first chapter, you find yet another example of depression. Notice what Paul writes in verse 8. For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction, which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively, beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Paul said he struggled with depression. We were at the point of questioning whether we wanted to go on or not. We can understand that. We can appreciate it. But let's go back. Let's go back to David and get a clear understanding of just what depression is. In Psalms 34, verse 18, David talks about being crushed in spirit. He's depressed. He's broken. He's devastated. Now, the National Institute of Mental Health gives this definition of depression: a mental condition characterized by an inability to concentrate, insomnia, feeling of extreme sadness, dejection, state of hopelessness. Happy camper? No. Absolutely not. But yet we realize that from time to time, that describes our mental outlook, that we've been there, that we struggle with that. But if you go into go over to the 40th chapter of Psalms. We'll get there in a second. But before we look at that passage, I want us to realize something. That again, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, 21 million people at any one time in the United States suffer from extreme depression. During the pandemic, there are 3 times as many individuals suffering from depression as previous. So what does depression bring on? Brings on an empty mood, worthlessness, helplessness. There's a lack of interest in anything that might even be designed as pleasurable. Decreased energy, fatigue, aches and pains that really don't respond to any treatment. Depression is a killer. Truly is. But think back to that wonderful counselor. I've got a couple books called Prophets of Psychoheresy, and deals with the idea of psychology as man knows it. My doctoral thesis, dissertation, was on the parasitic paralysis of psychological seduction, taking the position that a lot of what's going on in the mental health industry is just that, it's an industry. And that we could find the answers if we simply go back to the wonderful counselor. That is, we can find the answers in most cases. Because that is what God promised us. That is the message of hope that is there for all of mankind. That Jesus is the wonderful counselor. And if we'll just look to him, we can find exactly what it is that is going to help overcome a lot of what we deal with. Now, you're there in Psalms 40. And I want you to look at verse 1. And notice what David writes. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me, heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay. He set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm. And he put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and trust in the Lord. I like the first part of verse 2. He brought me up out of the pit. You remember where we were looking at earlier, back in the 143rd Psalm. I'm in the pit. I'm in the bottom of everything. I was watching the Three Stooges last night before the Oregon game come on, and I was enjoying it. And they were in the tomb of King Rootin' Tootin', and they were lamenting that they had destroyed the mummy of Rootin' Tootin'. And poor old Curly got knocked down into a pit. And he goes, get me out of the pit. Help, help. Throw me down a rope. Ultimately, he was brought up out of the pit. Have you ever been in a pit? Have you ever been down in a pit? When I was thinking of that, watching that Three Stooges last night, knowing we were going to be in this verse, and my mind went to another pit. When Linda and I first had gotten married, we moved to Oregon, a little place called Days Creek. And we had a pump for water that would come off of the creek. And it stopped up, it got dry. And the pump was down, way down in a pit. And so my brother Bob, my brother Ron, and I were looking down at it. And we knew it was plugged up. And so we go, well, who's going to go down? And the lot fell to my brother Ron. So down he goes, down to the bottom of the pit. Bob and I thought, well, it'd be a good time to go and have lunch. And they're putting his old Ron down there fixing the pump. Hey, 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 get me out of here. Oh, was he upset when we pulled him up? Oh, he was angry. He's the oldest one of us. But he got the pump fixed. But he didn't want to stay down in that pit. And truly, we don't want to stay in that mental pit that we have. And so what David is saying, I tried what God had to offer. And you know what? God pulled me up out of that pit. Took some work on my part, but the victory is there. He brought me up out of the pit. And if he can do that with David, he can do it with each and every one of us. Because God has promised in 2 Peter 1 and verse 3, he has promised to give us all things pertaining to life and godliness. But see, there's a problem. And the problem a lot of times is us. And it was for David. David was not a pleasant person to be around. After David had gone through and had been involved in the killing of Bathsheba's husband. There's no way to deny it. David was guilty of murder. And David carried that guilt with him. And he was not pleasant to be around at all. And ultimately, Nathan had to confront him. And he did confront him. And it's called the Nathan Principle. And the Nathan Principle is simply this. You let somebody know that they're in sin and that they have to deal with the consequences of that sin. And until they do, they're not going to be very pleasant. And so Nathan went to him and laid out a scenario, which you can read in 2 Samuel 12. Laid out a scenario. And then when David was incredulous about the way it was laid out, thinking that it was somebody else, Nathan goes to him, you are that man. You're him. And you've got to deal with that guilt. That had to be hard to go before the king and say, you are that man. See, that's what a lot of people struggle with. I mean, yes, we can have depression due to loss of a loved one and for a number of other reasons. But more often than not, our depression is because of guilt. Something that we've done that is of a sinful nature that we have not yet to deal with. We've got to face it. That's why we're so despondent, because we haven't really looked. We haven't really seen or been honest enough to see it and then correct the issue. See, Jesus came as the wonderful counselor. He was made like his brethren in all things. He went through what we went through. In Isaiah 53, it said he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He knows what we feel. And yet he became the propitiation for our sins. Look at Hebrews, the 2nd chapter. And if you read the first 7 verses and then drop down to verses 17 through 19, it's really quite impressive. Because what you see there is that, yes, indeed, he does become the propitiation for our sins. Means he laid down his life for us. And as such, he then becomes our high priest, our mediator in all of those things. And see, here's the beautiful part about it. In Romans, the 5th chapter, he did that while we were engaged against him in hostilities. We did not deserve it at all. At all. And I know I've told this story, but grant me the indulgence again, because it's apropos. My parents had not been married that long, as you know the history of my parents and my family. I had done something to try to get my brother Bob in trouble. I knew I was wrong. I was guilty as the day is long. My mother knew I was guilty. I was sent to my room no ice cream. Everybody else was having homemade ice cream with the chocolate sauce and all sorts of good things. I could hear them laughing. I could hear them enjoying one another's company. And I'm there, I'm about 6 years old. The tears are running down my face. Maybe it's 5. But the tears are running down. Nobody loves me. My mother comes in with ice cream. Little bowl, no chocolate on it. But it was the sweetest and best ice cream I could ever have. And here's why. She handed it to me and she said, you know, Bruce, you don't deserve this at all. But I'm doing it because I love you. That's exactly what Christ did in Romans 5. You didn't deserve it, but I want you to know that I love you. Jesus is our wonderful counselor because he's come to help us deal with that contagion of guilt that takes us down into the pit of depression because we're sinful and we've sinned. Now, again, like I said, there are other forms of depression. We're not talking about those now, about the loss of a loved one and different things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the hardcore sin, things that separate us from God, that move us in an alienated state. And it was while we were enemies that Christ did that for us. Now, watch what what we can see about Paul. Go back. You can kind of see it on the overhead. In Acts, go into Acts. You're going to go into the 9th chapter. Paul has just seen Christ on the road as he was on the road to Damascus to imprison Christians. And look at verse 8. And Saul got up from the ground. And though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. Leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. 3 days. Now, those 3 days, what do you think's going on in Paul's mind? 3 days. He's dealing with the guilt of imprisoning Christians, destroying homes, consenting to the death of Stephen. 3 days. The pit of despair. Finally, Ananias comes to him, begins talking to him, and points to the way. Christ died for you. You can find forgiveness. You can be brought out of that pit of depression, but you got to deal with sin. So why, Acts 22:16, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, calling on his name. You want to get out of there? You want to deal with sin? Because that's what's causing you all of this angst? Well, you've got to rise up. You've got to find the relief. And can you imagine the pain, the emotional pain he was feeling? I mean, I've done a lot of really heinous things in my life. Not proud of. Thanks be to God for the blood of Christ. But I can't imagine destroying homes, families, imprisoning people, having people killed. And I say, when Paul writes he was the chief of all sinners, and I say I argue with them. Yeah, because when the blood of Christ is applied to anyone's life, it does the work that it's needed to do. But I sit back intellectually as a human, and I go, what a skunk. Skunk's kind of in my brains right now. Last night, Adam put up cameras and lights, and all of a sudden he got an alert, and he looked on his phone, and the camera was showing a skunk crossing our path. So, Paul was the skunk, and there was no alert to him at all. And Paul, yeah, I can understand being in such turmoil for that period of time. Devastating. Well, turn over now to Matthew, the 11th chapter. Look at verse 28. Because in Matthew, the 11th chapter and verse 28, we find a promise from the wonderful counselor. Not only did he come to deal with sin and the guilt that we feel from that. And again, remember, we're talking about differentiations with regards to levels of oppression. But notice what he said, come to me, all you are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and I'm humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my load is light. See, the answer is ever before us, because Christ promised these things. And when you look at the scriptures and you look at Christ as the wonderful counselor, it is truly amazing, because what's laid out therein is a pattern for cognitive therapy. And I realize that, a lot of you aren't aware what cognitive therapy is. But cognitive therapy is what a lot of psychologists practice. And they really don't realize that if they just laid it side by side with the scriptures, which they fight against, that they could see what's going on. When I counsel people, I counsel from what's called a nouthetic standpoint. And what that is it's Bible-based. And people will call me and say, you've been referred to me. I'll go, great. Let's meet, let's talk. And they go, well, what kind of therapy do you offer? Nouthetic. Explain it to me. Okay. And they look at me and they go, really? I go, yeah. Absolutely. That's what I do. Well, don't you know? I know that theory. I don't practice it. Well, don't you believe? Yeah, I study that too. But here's what works. If you'll only be honest enough to put it into practice. Because Jesus is the wonderful counselor. And you look at it, and basically, I laid it out on the overhead. Cognitive therapy seeks for the individual to look at self, to recognize and change things that are amiss. Whoa! Revolutionary concept. But that's really what therapy is. When we begin to deal with the initial aspect of sin in your life, you've got to get it out. You've got to deal with sin. And Christ was sent to deal with sin. Now, as we go on, like I said, we might have other things enter into our life. Understandable. And if you just go back to the scriptures and look, you can find an answer. Luke, the 15th chapter, excellent place. It deals with the prodigal son. The prodigal son is fascinating. Sometimes, and I apologize, sometimes when I do these charts, when I see them and put them out, they appear one way. However, sometimes in the translation from PowerPoint to Google Slides, it kind of gets a little bit wonky. So if things look a little bit wonky, it ain't me. It's Google Slides. And they named Google for the right reason. Google it. Anyways, but look at Luke, the 15th chapter. And I want you to drop down into verse 17. The prodigal son. He finds himself devastated, alienated, and away from his father. But when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? I'll get up and go to my father. And we'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. So he recognized the problem. He's aware of it. And he sets about on a course of correction. I've looked inside myself. Here's what I've done. Whoa, did I miss the mark? So how do I correct it? Here's what I do. Now, I realize that many of the 12-step programs, and I'm familiar with many of them, they all have this to some degree in what they call for people to do. You've really got to recognize the problem. Then you have to go back and correct it. Makes sense. Here's the scriptures. Scriptures are teaching it. So I applaud those programs that they utilize and incorporate much of what's seen in the scriptures. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back. So verse 20, he got up, came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion for him, ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I'm not worthy. The father said, oh, yeah, you are. I am so glad that you've seen. I'm so glad that you've turned back. You are my son. You are loved. And putting it in today's vernacular, you're back in the will. It's all good. And the son felt a sense of relief because the son was going through this realm of cognitive therapy. Now, what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 13, verses 5 through 6, he said, test yourselves to see whether or not you're in the faith. Look at yourselves. In Romans, the 12th chapter, verses 1 and 2, renew your mind is what he says there. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your body a living sacrifices, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, perfect. Again, I'll simply go back to when I had my practice in Washington, and people would come, and I would offer various things as suggestions to them. They'd come back the next time, and I go, well, did you do those things? No. Didn't do them at all. Why not? I didn't think they'd work. Are you still a little bit down in the dumps? Yeah. Why? Well, you didn't do what you were told to do. I mean, when you look at the scriptures, they provide everything you need. Everything. One woman I told, I said her and her husband were having trouble. He had been a preacher for a mainline denomination. He had 11 affairs on his wife. She took him back after each and every one. And I told her, we're trying to make this relationship work. I said, if you get angry at him, you don't yell at him. You call me. You yell at me. You scream at me. And I said, I will go to him. Friday night, 10:30 at night. Linda answers the phone. She picks it up. And all of a sudden she goes, it's for you. And I can hear the screaming from across the room. So I take the phone, go into the back. I put it on speakerphone. I set the phone down. I just sit there and listen. I let her get it all out, let it all vent. It was important that she do that. Then she began to see where she was wrong. Not to the degree he was, but where she had handled the situation wrong. See, when we begin to look at ourselves openly and honestly, we can really begin to see where we're wrong. And it takes a while to readjust our mind. Didn't it take you a while to readjust your way of thinking after you became a Christian? And it's work that's constantly before us. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to learn to set your mind on things above. And when you do that, you then can cast your anxieties onto God, which is what's found back in 1 Peter, the 5th chapter, and verse 7. You'll also celebrate relationships. Here's one of those times where it doesn't translate well from PowerPoint to Google, but you get the gist. You need positive relations. George Burns would have been absolutely nothing had it not been for his wife, Gracie Allen. But she would have been nothing had it not been for George Burns. They were perfect in the way that they interact. Now, many of you don't know that. If you don't know them, you're missing some of the greatest comedy that has ever been. So stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning. Turn it on antenna TV and sit back and be amused. They needed each other. Well, guess what? You and I, when we obeyed the gospel, we're brought into the household of God. And we need each other. We're reconciled. We have a relationship. We have a balance. And that's what we're all about. A balance. And we offer strength and we offer comfort. I really like Romans, the 15th chapter and verse 1, because it says we are with strength. Lend it. Support those without strength. All of us are strong or weak at one time or another. Right now, I would venture to say 25% of you are feeling weak. 25% of you are feeling pretty strong. The others are just kind of there. But it's going to vary from week to week, day to day. And so what we need to do is we need to be looking out for one another, trying to help one another, encourage one another. And that's part of this design that the wonderful counselor brought into being. Because we are a family. And many families are being blended, truly blended together. Look back at the book of Proverbs. Our time's just about up. Proverbs, the 12th chapter. And there's a lot more we could get into, undoubtedly. We'll talk a little bit more about it this afternoon. But in Proverbs, the 12th chapter, go down with me to verse 25. Solomon writes the following. Anxiety in the heart of a man weighs it down. But a good word makes it glad. It doesn't take much. It really doesn't take a whole lot to let people know they're appreciated. And it really doesn't take a whole lot to involve yourself in self-guided cognitive therapy when you're using the Bible as your guide. Doesn't take a lot. And here's the beautiful part about it. If you want somebody to help you and guide you, you don't need somebody that's got letters behind his or her name. You don't. Because by and through design of the scriptures, we lean on one another. We strengthen one another. We support one another. We help one another. And that's why people, when they ask or they know what I've done, they say, do I call you doctor? And I go, no, you call me Bruce. Because I went to school longer than y'all doesn't mean I'm smarter than you. It really doesn't. Because everything that we do when we're talking about these things has got to be according to what the scriptures teach. Nothing more, nothing less. Because Jesus is the wonderful counselor. And I'm going to leave you with that. That's the way I want to leave this lesson. We'll pick it up this afternoon, looking at a little different slice of it. Spend some time. Look at Psalms 42, verse 11. Look over at Hebrews, the 6th chapter, verses 17 through 20. It talks there about the hope, a hope sure and steadfast, one that enters within the veil. Hope, the anchor of the soul. We have hope because we have Christ. Well, the lesson is yours. But if there's anyone here that might be subject to the invitation anyway, realizing that you've got sin in your life and you've never put on Christ in the waters of baptism for the remission of sin, you've never really come in contact with the cleansing power of the blood of Christ, you haven't been added by God to the household wherein all of us are family members, that invitation is extended to you to do that this morning. If you know that's what you need to do. If you need to study more on it, we'll be glad to set up a time. Maybe you've already done that, but you need the prayers of the congregation for strength and or encouragement. However we can be of spiritual service.
Born of his Spirit, washed in his blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior